In the summer of 1961, Berlin was the most dangerous city on Earth. It was not the capital of a superpower, it was not an active battlefield, and it was not even a fully sovereign city. And yet, what happened there brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer to direct military confrontation than at any point since the end of the Second World War. The Berlin crisis of 1961 was not a single moment or sudden escalation. It was a result of years of unresolved tension, ideological confrontation, and a divided city standing at the center of the Cold War. To understand why American and Soviet tanks would eventually face each other in the streets of Berlin, it is necessary to return to the ruins of Europe in 1945. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, Europe lay in devastation. Entire cities were destroyed, governments had collapsed, and millions of people were displaced. Germany itself ceased to exist as a unified state. Instead, it was divided into occupation zones controlled by the victorious Allied powers. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union each administered their own zone. Berlin, the former capital of the Reich, was located deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, yet it too was divided into 4 sectors. From the very beginning, this arrangement was unstable. Berlin became a political anomaly, an isolated pocket of Western influence surrounded entirely by Soviet-controlled territory. What had been intended as a temporary solution soon turned into a permanent fault line of the emerging Cold War. As relations between the former Allies deteriorated, Berlin became a powerful symbol of ideological confrontation. To the Western powers, West Berlin represented freedom, democracy, and resistance to communist expansion. To the Soviet Union, it represented a vulnerability, an opening through which Western influence penetrated the heart of East Germany. By 1949, Germany was formally divided into 2 separate states. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany was established. In the East, the German Democratic Republic was formed under Soviet influence. Berlin remained divided as well. This division, however, was not enforced by walls or fences. It existed only through political agreement and mutual restraint. Throughout the 1950s, people could still move freely between East and West Berlin. And they did. For East Germany, this freedom of movement soon became a crisis. The East German economy lagged far behind the West. Political repression fueled dissatisfaction. And most damaging of all, millions of citizens simply left. They did not escape through guarded borders or minefields. They boarded trains, crossed streets, and walked from East Berlin into West Berlin, never to return. By 1961, an estimated 3 million East Germans had fled to the West. Many were young, educated, and highly skilled. Doctors, engineers, technicians, and professionals left in massive numbers. This mass emigration threatened the economic stability and political legitimacy of the East German state. For Soviet leaders, the situation was becoming intolerable. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, viewed Berlin as a bleeding wound. Every defection undermined communist authority. Every escape served as a propaganda victory for the West. At the same time, Berlin was a test of resolve. If the Soviet Union allowed the Western presence to continue unchecked, it risked appearing weak. If it acted too aggressively, it risked triggering a war with the United States. The challenge was finding a solution that would stop the flow of refugees without provoking a catastrophic confrontation. In 1958, Khrushchev attempted to force a resolution. He issued an ultimatum demanding that Western powers withdraw from Berlin and transform the city into a neutral, demilitarized zone. If the West refused, he threatened to hand over control of access routes to East Germany, effectively cutting off West Berlin. The ultimatum failed. The United States and its allies refused to abandon the city. President Dwight D. Eisenhower made it clear that Western access to Berlin was non-negotiable. The crisis was postponed, not resolved. In January 1961, a new American president entered the White House. John F. Kennedy was young, relatively inexperienced in foreign policy, and immediately confronted with escalating Cold War tensions. Only months into his presidency, Kennedy suffered a major setback with a failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. The operation damaged American credibility and emboldened Khrushchev, who began to question the resolve of the new president. Once again, Berlin moved to the center of the Cold War. Throughout the spring and summer of 1961, tensions increased rapidly. Diplomatic meetings failed to produce compromise. Refugees continued to flee East Germany through Berlin in growing numbers. East German leader Walter Ulbricht pressed Moscow for decisive action, warning that the state could not survive without sealing the border. Khrushchev hesitated, fully aware of the risks, but time was running out. Then, in the early hours of August 13, 1961, the situation changed overnight. East German forces began sealing the border. Streets were torn up, barbed wire was laid, rail lines were cut, and armed guards took positions. Berlin was being divided, physically. At first, there was no wall. There was wire. There were barricades. But soon concrete followed. Families were separated, streets were split in half, and the city was divided by force. The Berlin Wall had begun to rise. The Western powers protested, but they did not intervene. American forces did not attempt to tear down the barriers. British and French troops remained in their sectors. For many Berliners, this restraint felt like abandonment. For Khrushchev, it was confirmation that the West would not go to war over the internal borders of East Germany. But the crisis was not over. Berlin was not only divided by walls, it was divided by armies. And in October 1961, at a small crossing point known as Checkpoint Charlie, that division would bring American and Soviet tanks face to face, bringing the Cold War closer than ever to open conflict. After construction of the Berlin Wall began, the city entered a new and dangerous phase. What had once been a political division was now enforced by concrete, barbed wire, and armed guards. Movement between East and West Berlin was no longer a matter of choice. It was a matter of life and death. East German border troops were given strict orders. Escape attempts were to be stopped by force if necessary. Within days, Berliners began to understand that the division of their city was no longer temporary. It was permanent. For the Western powers, the situation presented a dilemma. The United States, Britain, and France did not recognize East German authority over Berlin. Yet the wall itself had been constructed entirely within East German territory. Tearing it down by force would almost certainly provoke a military confrontation with the Soviet Union. President Kennedy, still shaken by the Bay of Pigs failure, was determined to avoid a direct clash that could escalate into nuclear war. Publicly, Kennedy condemned the wall as a symbol of oppression. Privately, he accepted a harsh reality. As long as Western access to West Berlin remained intact, the wall, however brutal, was preferable to war. His position was summed up bluntly: a war is a hell of a lot better than a war. This calculated restraint, however, did not mean the crisis was over. The true danger lay not in the wall itself, but in how authority was enforced at the crossing points between East and West Berlin. Access routes were governed by post-war agreements that guaranteed the rights of the Western Allies. East Germany, however, was not recognized as a sovereign authority by the United States. Any attempt by East German guards to control Allied movement risked provoking a confrontation. That confrontation came in October 1961. On October 22nd, an American diplomat attempted to cross into East Berlin. East German border guard demanded to inspect his identification. The United States rejected this demand. From Washington's perspective, only Soviet authorities, not East German ones, had the legal right to control Allied access. Allowing East German guards to exercise authority would imply recognition of East Germany itself. The American diplomat was eventually allowed through, but the message was clear. The border crossings had become flashpoints. President Kennedy authorized a firm response. American military vehicles began escorting U.S. officials through Checkpoint Charlie without submitting to East German inspections. The message was deliberate. The United States would not accept any erosion of its rights in Berlin. East German authorities responded by increasing their presence at the crossing. Soviet commanders watched closely. What had begun as a bureaucratic dispute now carried enormous symbolic weight. Each side was testing the other's resolve. On October 27th, the situation escalated dramatically. Soviet tanks rolled into position on the eastern side of Checkpoint Charlie. American tanks responded, taking up positions on the western side. The distance between them was less than 100 meters. Their guns were loaded, engines idled, crews waited for orders. For 16 hours, American and Soviet tanks faced each other in the heart of Berlin. The world was closer to war than most people realized. This was no distant standoff across borders, oceans. This was direct, visible confrontation between the armed forces of the two nuclear superpowers. Any shot fired, whether intentional or accidental, could trigger a chain reaction that neither side could control. Military commanders on both sides understood the stakes. Yet neither was willing to withdraw first. Behind the scenes, frantic diplomacy unfolded. In Washington, Kennedy followed developments hour by hour. He understood that Berlin was not worth a nuclear war, but he also knew that retreating under pressure could weaken America's credibility across the world. In Moscow, Khrushchev faced the same dilemma. He had achieved his primary objective by stopping the flow of refugees, but allowing the confrontation to spiral out of control would be catastrophic. The solution came not through public negotiation, but through quiet, indirect communication. Late on October 28, Soviet and American officials reached an understanding. The tanks would withdraw simultaneously and gradually. No announcements, no declarations of victory, just de-escalation. One by one, the tanks backed away. The immediate crisis ended without a single shot being fired. Berlin remained divided. The war remained standing, but war had been avoided. The Checkpoint Charlie standoff marked the climax of the Berlin crisis. It demonstrated how easily the Cold War could shift from political tension to military confrontation. It also revealed a sobering truth. Once escalation began, control could slip away rapidly. Decisions made by individual commanders, diplomats, or political leaders carried global consequences. In the months that followed, Berlin stabilized into an uneasy status quo. The war became more permanent, more fortified, and more lethal. Escape attempts continued, often ending in tragedy. Families remained divided. The city became the most visible symbol of the Cold War, a concrete line separating two worlds. For Kennedy and Khrushchev, the Berlin crisis left a lasting impression. Both men had seen how close they had come to war. Both understood that future crises could be even more dangerous. Less than a year later, that understanding would be tested again, this time in Cuba. Berlin, 1961, was a warning. The world would soon discover how fragile peace truly was. The Berlin crisis of 1961 did not end with the withdrawal of tanks at Checkpoint Charlie. It ended only in the narrowest sense. Open war had been avoided, but the deeper consequences of the crisis would shape the Cold War for years to come. Berlin was no longer a question waiting for resolution. It had become a frozen reality. The war remained. The division was permanent. And the ideological fault line running through Europe was now reinforced by concrete and steel. For the East German government, the construction of the Berlin Wall achieved its immediate objective. The mass exodus of citizens to the West was stopped almost overnight. The economic and political hemorrhaging that had threatened the survival of the state was brought under control. From the perspective of East Berlin, the wall was described not as a prison, but as a protective barrier. In reality, it was a symbol of containment, designed to keep people in, not enemies out. For the Soviet Union, the outcome was mixed. Khrushchev had succeeded in stabilizing East Germany without provoking war. The Western powers had accepted the wall as a fact on the ground. Yet the crisis also revealed limits to Soviet power. Berlin remained divided. Western access to West Berlin remained intact. The city continued to exist as a visible challenge to communist authority. Most importantly, the crisis exposed how close miscalculation could bring the world to catastrophe. For the United States, the lessons were equally sobering. President Kennedy emerged from the crisis with a deeper understanding of Cold War dynamics. He had resisted military escalation, but at the cost of accepting a divided Berlin. This restraint was criticized by some allies and domestic opponents, who saw the war as a moral failure. Yet Kennedy believed the alternative, war, would have been far worse. Privately, Kennedy was shaken by how quickly events had spiraled toward confrontation. The tank standoff at Checkpoint Charlie had not been planned. It had emerged from a series of incremental decisions, bureaucratic disputes, and symbolic gestures. Control had nearly been lost not through deliberate aggression, but through momentum. This realization would have lasting consequences. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev began to reassess their assumptions. Each had tested the other's resolve. Each had stepped back at the last moment. And each now understood something essential. The Cold War could not be managed indefinitely through brinkmanship alone. Berlin had demonstrated that credibility and restraint were locked in constant tension. Showing weakness invited pressure. Showing strength risked escalation. Navigating between the two required caution, communication, and a willingness to compromise, often in secret. Yet these lessons were learned unevenly. Within the Soviet leadership, Berlin reinforced Khrushchev's belief that bold moves could succeed if they stopped short of direct war. The West had not intervened to stop the war. The tanks had withdrawn without consequence. To Khrushchev, this suggested that the United States, despite its power, was reluctant to risk nuclear conflict over political symbols. This interpretation would prove dangerous. Less than a year after the Berlin crisis, Khrushchev would attempt another bold maneuver, this time far beyond Europe. The decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba was shaped, in part, by the experience of Berlin. Khrushchev believed that strategic surprises, carefully calibrated, could alter the balance of power without provoking war. Kennedy, meanwhile, entered the Cuban Missile Crisis with Berlin fresh in his memory. He had seen how quickly confrontation could escalate. He had learned the importance of controlling tempo, maintaining unity among advisors, and keeping channels of communication open. These lessons would influence every decision he made in October 1962. In this sense, Berlin was a rehearsal, a warning shot fired not with bullets, but with steel and silence, The city remained divided for nearly 3 decades. Families were separated. Lives were lost attempting to cross the wall. Berlin became the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, a physical manifestation of a world split between competing systems. But Berlin was also a lesson written in concrete. It showed that the Cold War was not an abstract geopolitical struggle. It was a lived reality, shaped by human decisions, fear, and restraint. It showed that peace in the nuclear age depended not on victory, but on avoidance. And it showed how easily the line between crisis and catastrophe could disappear. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, it marked not just a reunification of a city, but the collapse of the order that had produced crises like that of 1961. Yet the memory of Berlin remained, a reminder of a moment when the world stood still, tanks faced each other in silence, and history waited to see whether reason would prevail. In 1961, reason did prevail, but only just.